Hello, everybody. My name is Karl Widerquist. I am a member of the big committee that runs USBIG, and I'm the editor of Basic Income News, which is a joint project of USBIG and of BN and several other BN's affiliates. And I'm a coordinator of the Basic Income Earth Network. And before we get started talking about Sheahan, I do have several announcements to make. First, Basic Income News is going to be going under major expansion over the next few months. And if you'd like to get involved, we're going to have a meeting at the 3:30 coffee break on Saturday. I think it's in room, one of the rooms upstairs, I think it's 201 or 203. Okay, I'll confirm the room with Jürgen, and I will announce that next time I speak tomorrow. But if you're interested in getting involved with BI News, we need all kinds of people with all kinds of skills to help improve what we're doing there. So either contact me or come to that meeting at the coffee break at 3:30 on Saturday. The other news that I have is several of us tonight are going to be meeting after the conference is over. We're going to go out for dinner or drinks at a place that in French is called, let me mangle this for you, Les Trois Boissons, which is French for the Three Brewers. So it's a bar-restaurant combination. I'll tell you how to get there. You walk down Rue Stanley, which is right over there. Walk down Rue Stanley for 3 blocks, then you make a right and go 2.5 blocks till you get to 1356 Rue Sainte-Catherine-Ouest. And that's where the Three Brewers is. And so a bunch of us are meeting there, so come on, all, spread the word. Come on down. Anytime, just trickle in after this is over. There's no rush. Okay, so now, that's tonight. Okay, that's tonight. So now Basic Income News is reporting on all kinds of things. It's reporting on the news. It's reporting on the news of basic income. We report on the mainstream stuff that's happening. We report on the Alaska dividend, which is a policy, the closest thing that exists to a basic income in the world today. We report on the Swiss referendum and the European Union referendum. The pilot projects have been going on in Kenya and in Uganda and in Namibia and India. We report on what people write about basic income. We report about the academic articles. We also report on crazy, lunatic, fringe blogs on basic income. We report on a little everything. And I volunteered in 1999. I was one of the founding members of USBIG, and I volunteered to write the newsletter. And it was a lot of excitement to write the newsletter because I got to know what was going on. I got to know what was going on basic income. By accident, I practically became an expert in the Alaska dividend because just from reporting on it so much. But it occurred to me very quickly that there was a sad side effect to being the newsletter editor of a movement that I am a part of. And that sad side effect was that I read obituaries. And there are a lot of us in the movement, and of all ages. And I've, over the years, seen people closer and closer to me die and had to write up an obituary of Sheahan. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about today, is Sheahan, who was a founding member of USBIG, and he was writing about basic income for a good 20 years before I met him in the early 2000s. He was a tireless campaigner, and in his spare time, he was a steeplechase runner. That is, you think you know a steeplechase is a horse event. Well, a human steeplechase is too. It's a long-distance event where you run over obstacles. You jump over, you jump hurdles, and you jump over water, and this and that, and the other thing. It's a long-distance obstacle race. And that's what Sheahan was to the basic income movement. It was a long-distance obstacle race runner who's been writing about this is the obituary that I wrote for my close associate, Al Sheahan. Al Sheahan was an author, an athlete, a disc jockey, a promoter, a publisher, and a longtime campaigner for the Basic Income Guarantee, or BIG. He died at his home in Sherman Oaks, California on October 29th, 2013, after battling myelofibrosis, a slow-moving bone marrow disease for over 10 years. I never mentioned this to you. 3 months, I think, before he died, he was calling me up to tell me about all of his appearances on TV and radio to talk about his new book on basic income. And he said nothing about, and I'm dying of myelofibrosis, never said a thing, myelofibrosis. Sheahan is known in the movement for BIG as a tireless, long-term campaigner. He helped found the USBIG network. He helped keep the idea of a basic income guarantee alive during an era when it fell out of mainstream politics in the United States. And he wrote some of the best introductory books on basic income that exists in the world. He was born on June 28, 1932 in Cleveland, Ohio. He moved to California in 1957. His first book on BIG, Guaranteed Income, The Right to Economic Security, came out on Gain Publications in January of 1983, and perhaps the nadir of the basic income movement in the United States. After there had been a growing interest in the 60s and 70s, dying out in the late 70s, and coming back with the birth of the basic income European network in 1986, beginning to come back very slowly, but right there in 83, right at the lowest point, sort of Al Sheahan is, I'm getting behind this idea. The BIG, under various names, including the guaranteed income, was a major topic of American mainstream politics in the mid-60s and 70s, when it was seen by many people across the political spectrum as the obvious next step in the movement to improve the welfare system. However, BIG dropped out of favor in the late 1970s when new right politicians such as Ronald Reagan and others found success vilifying the poor and as some kind of lazy rabble and say we got to make them prove that they deserve something by making them work for it. Supporters of the welfare system often went on the defensive and stopped looking for new ideas, except perhaps for those that placated the new right's desire for stringent work requirements. They said, well, new rights, they so much want to make people, want to make sure everybody works, that we got to make sure the only way we'll ever get something passed progressively is if it includes work requirements. Of course, in those 30 years, none of those progressive work requirement programs have been passed either. And so into this void, Al Sheahan's 1983 book argued that it makes much more sense just to put a floor under everyone's income. And in his book, he raised all the objections that the other side might bring up. He asked the tough questions and he answered them with knowledgeable but disarmingly simple, compelling prose that anyone can understand. Many bigots believe that this book is still the best introduction to BIG, with the possible exception of his 2012 book, we'll talk about in a minute. Now, in the political climate of 1983, Al Sheahan's book was widely ignored, but Sheahan didn't stop. He was a journalist, and he wrote a long string of editorials on BIG and other topics in publications across the country. Over the years, he wrote for Time Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Daily News, the Huffington Post, and many other publications. In 1999, the BIG movement began to revive in the United States, and a group made up mostly of East Coast academics established the U.S. Basic Income Guarantee Network, USBIG. Sheahan quickly joined the movement. He not only became a leader of the organization, but he also, along with Robert Harris, Francis Fox Pittman, and others, he gave the new movement for BIG a connection with the movement of the 1960s and 70s. As a leader of USBIG, Sheahan stepped up his work. He attended and presented new ideas at the annual USBIG Congress, now known as the North American BIG Congress, NABIG, you're at it right now. And he also presented at the biannual BN Congresses. In 2004, he co-authored the paper, A Proposal to Transform the Standard Deduction into a Refundable Tax Credit, which is also known as H.R. 5257 in the 109th Congress, colon, the tax cut for the rest of this act of 2006. Well, it only achieved 2 co-signers, didn't make it a committee, but the idea was simple. It was replace the standard tax deduction, which everyone in the United States gets if they choose not to itemize their deductions, to replace that with a refundable tax credit. And in the process, introducing a small BIG. The preamble of the bill states simply, to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to provide a basic income guarantee in the form of a refundable tax credit for taxpayers who do not itemize deductions. Sheahan not only co-authored the paper on which the bill was based, he also recruited a member of Congress to introduce the bill and lobbied on its behalf. He made several trips to Washington from his home in California and met with any member of Congress or staffer who was willing to talk about the idea. He found a member of Congress to introduce it, at least one other signed as co-sponsor, but the bill did not get out of committee and expired at the end of the 109th Congress. It is yet to be reintroduced. Sheahan's next major project was a new book, The Basic Income Guarantee, Your Right to Economic Security, published on June 19th, 2012 by Palgrave Macmillan. It was largely an update of Sheahan's 1983 book, but this time it was put out by a major publisher with greater distribution. According to former U.S. Senator and former Democratic nominee for President George McGovern, this book is a great idea, brilliantly stated. Some may think that it's ultra-liberal, as they did when I proposed a similar idea in 1972. But I see it as true conservatism, the right of income for all Americans sufficient for food, shelter, and basic necessities, or what Jefferson referred to as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The book came out at a time with growing interest in BIG. It continues to sell well, and is the most popular item on Palgrave's book series exploring the basic income guarantee. Sheahan followed up the book with a speaking tour and a large number of editorials in major newspapers. As late as August of 2013, less than 90 days before his death, Sheahan was on television, radio, and print media campaigning for BIG. Right up to the end, after more than 30 years in the fight, Sheahan was one of the hardest working people in the BIG movement. When he wasn't working on BIG, Sheahan was also many other things, as I mentioned at the outset. He was a competitor and a leader of and an organizer of what's called Masters Athletics. That is, athletics for men and women over 35 years of age. He was active in master track and field for decades, and he was so important to that movement that when he died, Master Track magazine entitled their obituary, "A Giant Has Died, Al Sheahan was our chronicler and our conscience." According to the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Al Sheahan served 10 years as treasurer of the World Association of Veteran Athletes. He founded a magazine called National Masters at the News and served as its editor for nearly 4 decades. According to the Los Angeles State News in 1998, he was introduced into the Masters Track and Field Hall of Fame. His favorite events were the 400-meter hurdles and the 3,000-meter steeplechase, the longest obstacle jumping event in running. A long-distance obstacle race is a fitting metaphor for Sheahan's 3 decades of work in the big movement. The goal was far, the obstacles were many, and Sheahan ran on.
Karl mentioned, Al attended most of the meetings of USBIG and several BA meetings. I actually met Al at the same time Karl did. I moved to Washington, D.C. in fall of '99, and a few months later I met a political activist who had recently moved from California who saw my first self-published book about basic income and said, "I know this guy in Southern California that you need to get in touch with." So he gave me Al's phone number, and I called Al, and we had a number of conversations on the phone. And then a few months later, we learned about this little group of 5 or 6 people who were meeting at Columbia University to talk about BIG, and So I drove up from Washington, D.C., and Al flew in from California, and the two of us went to one of those meetings with Karl and Michael Lewis and Eri and a few other folks. And that was the beginning of our friendship. Al, as Karl said, in all of my research into basic income, again, as we all know, it was a widespread idea supported by moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans, leading economists from the left and the right back in the 60s and into the 70s. And in my research, I could find almost nothing published about it in the 80s except for Al's book. Al became interested in this just as an activist for poverty issues. He also volunteered for Results. He did volunteer filling out tax forms for poor folks. And he continued to talk about BIG through the decades. As Karl mentioned, Al's birthday was June 28th. Al would have been 82 on Saturday. So if you happen to think of him during these next few days, he would have been 82. He would have been with us if he'd still been healthy. When he would come to Washington for any occasion, for a USBIG meeting or the lobbying that Karl did, so Al and I spent several days on Capitol Hill visiting members of Congress. And I have to tell you, it was one of the most dreary, depressing activities. And we had very nice conversations, but the more senior the person we talked to, the more negative they were. We didn't meet with any actual members during that trip, but we met with several chiefs of staff and a number of young aides and policy people. And if you really want to know how dysfunctional the U.S. political system is, I invite you to come to Washington and talk to staffers, because a lot of the real work is being done by kids in their 22 and 24 who are just out of college or in law school. But the senior staff people, basically, without exception, told us that this idea is not going anywhere. The Democratic Party is afraid to even talk about it. And one of my jobs with Al was to just keep saying, yes, but every conversation we have is moving it forward, and you and I know that sooner or later this idea has to come back. And one of my favorite experiences during those couple of days, we had lunch in the cafeteria in the Rayburn office building. And after lunch, we had an appointment up on the 3rd floor. And because it was lunchtime, the elevator was full of young staffers. And Al and I were chatting, and everyone else was quiet. And I took that opportunity and turned to him and said, you know, Al, the reason it's so important that we're working for a guaranteed income is so that one day we might live in a real democracy without leaving the country. And these young staffers did what you just did. Several of them chuckled, and one of them actually turned around and said, good luck. But he really was a long-distance runner, and he remained committed to the end. We talked every few months about the next book that I'm writing and about other projects and how we can move things forward. And I'm here to tell you that Al is still with us and is still working on this issue. I don't yet have the details. I'm waiting to hear from his brother. But Al left a considerable amount of money in a trust fund in his will to promote basic income. So when we know more about the details about how much and how the trust will be managed, that will be reported, but it will be a considerable amount. So Al is still with us, and we can take heart from his example that he repeatedly would get depressed, and he would just want to withdraw, but he always kept at it, regardless. And he came to our meetings regardless, and usually he would just sit in the back and he would be fairly quiet, but his heart was so strong